Welcome to another STARS webinar. My name is David Dorn. I'm Director of Programs and Communication at STARS. We have over 40 participants joining today's webinar. So wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Today we talk with Marie-Astrid LANGER about her experience of covering the US presidential election as a foreign correspondent. Astrid is the West Coast correspondent of Neue Zuercher Zeitung, Switzerland's leading newspaper, founded in 1780. Based in San Francisco, she covers evolving technology trends in Silicon Valley, as well as political feature stories across America. Astrid is a young leader of Atlantikbrücke, the American-Swiss Foundation, and she is a STARS alumna. Previously, she was an NZZ editor in Zurich in charge of US domestic politics, and in 2015, she was the Arthur Burns Fellow with the Wall Street Journal's Technology Bureau in San Francisco. Astrid attended the Henry Nannen Journalism School in Hamburg with stints at the DC Bureau of Der Spiegel and Zeit Online. Hi, Astrid. Good evening to San Francisco. Great to see you.
Hi.
And thank you for staying up so late to talk with us.
Yeah, no problem. I was up anyways for Trump's speech. And hi to everyone wherever you are. I saw that we have quite the international circle tonight, morning, this afternoon, wherever. And I'm very excited to talk with you about the upcoming election here in the US and hear your questions.
Indeed. We now have 30 minutes to discuss with Astrid. I will take the privilege to ask the first couple questions. In the meantime, if you have any questions for Astrid, please use the Q&A feature below to type in your question. So without any further ado, let's get right into it. Just a few days ago, the Democratic National Convention and then the Republican National Convention have now formally nominated Joe Biden and Donald Trump to face off against each other in the election in November. Now, let's take a couple of steps back from the daily news cycle and assume just for a minute that none of us attending the webinar today had been following the virtual campaign trail over the last couple of weeks and months at all. How would you explain to us what this year's election is all about?
That is a very challenging question, but I will try to answer it. I think the essence of this year's election is how America feels about Donald Trump, him as a person, and if he is the right president for the various challenges that America is facing today. Donald Trump could have decided to make this election about the Democrats, about Joe Biden, but he decided to make it about himself. And given how polarizing this president is, and especially how aggravating he has been for the Democratic base in the last couple of years, the Democrats very happily jumped onto that train. And now the election seems to be a question of whether or not Donald Trump is fit for office, basically. And Democrats argue he is not, especially because of his handling of the coronavirus crisis. And Republicans argue that he is the only one who can lead America out of this deep health crisis and economic crisis, because they argue he has done so in the past couple of 4 years as a president, as an economics president, basically. And I think that is the quintessential question of this election. But there are so many different facets to it too. What kind of country is America? Does it want to be? How important is our international relations for the US? How, especially when it comes to foreign wars? What type of country does the US want to be? I think that's on the ballot on November 3rd.
How do you explain Donald Trump as a candidate then?
Donald Trump is pitching himself to the American electorate as a president of the little man, especially of the little forgotten man in flyover country, meaning the rural states, that he is fighting for the working class, that he understands their struggles. I think that's his main appeal. At the same time, he blows the dog whistle enough to send messages to the billionaires and entrepreneurs of the country that he will bring them more tax cuts, reminds them of the tax cuts that he has brought them. And he also portrays himself as a businessman. And interestingly, which was also visible at this week's convention, he also portrays himself as an outsider to Washington, as someone who's not part of the political establishment. And that message sort of clashes with some of the symbols that he chose this week, especially giving his speech in front, like in the White House, which is the symbol, the most important symbol for establishment in DC, right? Yeah, but that's basically, he tries to give himself the image of the representative of the little man in the US.
What about Joe Biden then? How would you describe Joe Biden as a candidate?
Yeah, Joe Biden can't help but acknowledge that he is part of the establishment, right? But he's playing the card in a way that he says that his 47 years in Congress actually qualify him like no one else to get the country out of this crisis. So he acknowledges that he is part of the establishment, but he also pitches himself as someone who has dedicated his entire life to public service, to fighting for the very people that he's asking now to vote for him. And he also casts himself as a very, as a man with a lot of empathy, as someone who has character, who understands the struggles, the personal struggles that so many Americans are facing these days. And his main appeal to the voters last week was basically that he's a man of character and of decency, and that's exactly what America needs these days.
US reporters and foreign correspondents like you are covering the same set of facts. As a foreign correspondent, however, I assume you're coming at the story from a different angle, covering the election as an outsider and with your reporting also primarily aimed at readers outside the US. So taking this vantage point of being an outsider, what's one thing you've noticed about the election that you feel Americans miss?
A thing that Americans, I want to say, miss is that they often don't fully understand how America's image outside of America and the rest of the world has changed in the last 4 years, I want to say. As you all know, America is a very America-focused country, so to say. I mean, people here don't read a lot, like the average American doesn't care very much, to put it bluntly, about the rest of the world very much. I mean, they might care, but they just don't have a lot of news access, and also given its geography, America is very much centered around itself. And I don't think Americans really realize how much the image that Europe and so many allies in the world have of the US has changed and actually deteriorated in the past 4 years. And that America is often perceived now as not reliable anymore.
Then the other way around, what's the hardest thing for the audience that you are writing for to understand about the race, about the US presidential election?
Yeah, actually, that's actually an easy answer for me, because I think many people don't understand Donald Trump's appeal to the American voter, and many people don't understand why so many viewers tonight in front of their TVs were certainly enthused by the speech that they heard that he gave for 70 minutes tonight, and why so many people are so excited about this president that so many Europeans, I want to say, perceive as just rude and I don't know, like a million characteristics that people, and stereotypes also that people have about Trump, and they don't understand how he ended up in the White House even after 4 years. And I think that's one of my main task as a journalist, I believe, to give a voice to these to that side of America that many of us just don't know.
What do you personally find most confusing about the election?
I think most confusing, or sometimes most just astonishing to me, is how Americans have such a different perception of their own country. I mean, coming from I'm a German citizen. I've lived in Switzerland for 6 years before I moved here. So I think I've lived in various other countries, but I've never seen such a stark division as I'm seeing right now in the US when it comes to the State of the Union, basically, right? Like I have some Republican friends who think that America is like the greatest it's ever been, or let's say like if we talk prior to Corona crisis, that America is basically the best it's ever been. And I have friends who are Democrats who are just like depressed every day because they feel like their country is being taken over. And I think that's something that I find most astonishing about covering what's going on in this country, because the division is so stark.
What has been the biggest struggle for you as a journalist to accurately inform your readers about what's happening in the US? Is there any topic or any situation that was particularly difficult to report on?
Yeah, well, I think outside of the election cycle, it's that the US is just such a huge country. And I mean, every state is so diverse. And I mean, there are so many stories that I feel like are underreported. For instance, like the struggles that Native Americans face in the country. That's something that's really dear to my heart. But we hardly ever read about. And I mean, it's great that now we're reading so much about and hearing so much about the oppression that African Americans have faced for way too long in this country and also in other countries. And I really hope that that eventually will also bring the conversation to what's going on with respect to Native Americans and the struggles that they are facing until this day in the country. But coming back to the election, I think it's hard because it's not that the presidential election is not decided by popular vote. It's 50 individual elections basically in every state, right? And it's hard to keep track of what's really going on in every country. And I mean, this year we're probably talking like 13 swing states, depending on how you define them. And it's just hard to stay on top of things in every state, and also to pick which state you want to visit, especially given that we are in a pandemic right now. And then there's also the race for Congress going on, right? That's also really challenging and to cover, but also so important for the power structure in DC going forward.
What has been your strangest experience on the campaign trail so far?
The strangest experience. It's probably going to be one of the questions where in like an hour from now, I'm going to think of this funny episode. But I think for now, like what comes spontaneously to my mind is a Trump rally that I went to in Iowa in February. That was just really fascinating. Also looking back on the campaign trail now, because it's just incredible to picture tens of thousands of people in a hall together. It was just really interesting to see. That was my first Trump rally, I gotta say, just because the country is so big and he doesn't really come to California. Trump really doesn't come to California, or at least not to hold a rally. That was really impressive to feel the atmosphere. I mean, he's just a showmaster, you know, like what everyone is saying about him when it comes to entertaining people. He's really just a great entertainer, and he really feels the crowd too. Like as soon as people might get bored, he just picks up the sentiment and starts like chanting or does little silly things like, you know, so for instance, he likes to walk onto the stage with various songs. One of them is God Bless the USA, and the other is YMCA. We all know these songs, right? But so he walks up to the microphone and he's like, you know, this song is just great, right? If you can't remember the words, just think of my latest trade deal, USMCA, and he starts dancing. And that's funny, right? I mean, people laugh, little things like that. It's entertaining. And it's hard to imagine coming from Europe, where our politicians are very different. It's refreshing too, I gotta say.
Opposed to the strangest experience, then, what has been the most memorable or the most inspiring experience of covering US politics?
Two things. One, I personally really like the patriotism and the emotions that American politicians are capable of evoking in a crowd. Like Americans in general are just really good speakers, I would say. And American politicians can be like, so, I don't know, I'm missing the word, like just so engaging. They can just really enthuse a crowd, and not just Trump, you know. I mean, I also went to various Pete Buttigieg or Elizabeth Warren events, or also Joe Biden. And it's just, they've really managed to create an atmosphere in a gym or whatever event hall they're in. That's one thing. And the second thing too is how like just interactions with voters on the campaign trail. I'm thinking of this, I don't know, of this one couple, for instance, that I met at a Pete Buttigieg rally in Iowa, I think it was, just like in a little tiny town 2 hours north of Des Moines. And people are just so friendly, and they just think it's so great that you're writing, that Europeans care about their elections, and they thank you for being here and for caring about it. And they're really open to share their own thoughts and their own thought process about it. Like this couple I was talking with, they were just torn back and forth between Biden and Buttigieg, and just saying what they like about him. Like, and they were also sharing that one of their children is gay, and that was just one of the things that made them interested in Pete Buttigieg. And it's just really good to not just read about what Americans think, but every interaction, I gotta say, I just really enjoy.
In politics, everywhere, there is a constant fight for what is true and what is not, who can shape the dominant narrative. In your daily work as a journalist, how do you navigate this spectrum? How do you separate fact from fiction?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, David, and I think it's really hard to answer because it's a struggle every day. One example, Donald Trump just claimed in his speech tonight that one claim that other Republicans made this week too, that is that every American that needed a ventilator got a ventilator, right? And the New York Times fact-checked that and claimed it as false. But then so that's basically, I'm watching Trump, I have the New York Times and Wall Street Journal live blog next to me while I'm watching it, and I'm chatting with a friend of mine on WhatsApp on the phone, and he's a Republican, and he's telling me how he doesn't think that the false fact-check result is accurate, because he thinks that, like, he was telling me then that the governor of New York just made like way too big demands when he asked for like 49,000 ventilators, and it was just totally surreal to ask for that many. And now that makes me want to now put my own research into such a seemingly easy claim, right? And it's just, especially in a country that's so deeply divided, it's sometimes really hard to, you just got to be really critical and question everything, and also do your own fact checking. And because sometimes some narratives just get repeated so often that you think it might be true, but then when you second guess yourself what the source is again, you know, like Trump has been really successful in questioning facts and alternative facts, like Kellyanne Conway said once, right? And it's a challenge. I think that's all I can say. And it demands a lot from us journalists too, to just like really put in the time for the research and just fact check to trusted, like untrusted websites, and go to other trusted sources.
We have a follow-up question from Tobias Vanchura of Metro Toledo. He's asking whether you have experienced accusations of being fake news. Yeah,
that is true. Like, especially on, like from my personal experience, especially on Republican campaign events, there is a lot of hostility, and people just see my press badge, but they don't know what outlet I'm with. And it's just overall a more negative sentiment towards the media. Like when I covered the midterm election in 2018, I went to a rally in Arizona, in Phoenix, for a Republican candidate there. And I could tell by standing in line outside that it would be smart to not show the media badge and like not take any notes. And I mean, whenever I talk with people, I'm telling them right away that I'm a journalist if they want to speak with me and whatever. And if people start insulting me, I just walk away. But I would also add that it's actually sometimes if people take the time to ask you who you're working for, it might be an advantage sometimes that I'm not part of the US media. People, I mean, Americans usually don't know NZZ, but like they like that Europeans care and they like that people ask questions. And I think in general, the only solution for that is to be a good representative of your trade and try to give people the impression that you actually want to hear them out and not just make assumptions.
How would you describe the impact of 4 years of Trump on the freedom of the press?
So one thing definitely is, the most obvious thing to me as a journalist is the skepticism and also sometimes the hatred towards the media. And I think that's evident in like during campaign rallies. That was also evident during the recent civil protests in various American cities, that some police officers are obviously just fed up with the media and were shooting rubber bullets at journalists with the badge clearly visible. So I think that more hateful attitude towards journalists is one result. It's also that, I mean, the media also plays along here, right? I mean, cable news are for-profit companies, usually here in the US, and they understood right at the beginning back in 2015 that they can actually make money off this guy named Donald Trump. So what topics they pick and how they cover him, and like they're mostly appealing to their base. I mean, I'm not saying that people are neglecting journalistic principles. I'm just saying that the type of stories they pick is like sometimes very predictable and just feeding into a narrative. And I think that's not only the fault of Donald Trump, that's also the fault of the media, but that's clearly something that has changed here in the past couple of years.
What role does social media play in the 2020 election?
I think that's going to be very interesting, especially the closer that the election day gets. So I think we got to differentiate between what role social media plays as a means of information, right? And I think that a lot of people just stay in their bubbles, and but I think at the same like the other side of the coin is what role social media is going to play in securing the election, right? Like in securing that the election is going to be fair and not manipulated by foreign or domestic special interests. And I mean, especially Facebook, but also Twitter and also Google and Google's YouTube, they've all gone to great lengths in the last couple of months, or actually in the last few years, ever since 2016, to up their game compared to 2016. But it remains to be seen. I mean, Facebook just introduced an election center, and they were saying, I was listening to a call on the security of the 2020 election, especially when it comes to disinformation. And there was someone from Facebook and Twitter, and they were saying that they're also worried about the period right after November 3rd, right? Because this year with the mail-in voting, we might not have a result right on election night, and that they're actually concerned about that potential period of insecurity and how they were going to inform people during that period. And I thought that was interesting, that they're also thinking ahead now and not just reacting to everything.
We have a question from Hakan Hedström. He's the head of Asian investment strategy at Zurich Insurance. He's asking, what is your experience about how people feel about China?
I think that China is one of the few topics that Americans, that Democrats and Republicans can actually agree on. and that is that it's increasingly skeptical attitude towards China. Like the degree of that skepticism varies between people, but overall, I don't think it's going to make a huge difference when it comes to China, who's going to win on November 3rd. Just because overall skepticism towards China and has really increased in the last couple of months. And I mean, I live here in Silicon Valley, right? And even Silicon Valley is nowadays under a ton of pressure to just take a hard stance and to not seek. I mean, it's considered despicable if you seek investments now, or like business in China, basically, right? Which is pretty crazy because everyone here in Silicon Valley is interested in growth, and China is the obvious opportunity. But overall, I would say that like China is one of those keywords where people can get aggravated sometimes, where it's perceived as a threat to national security, to all sorts of America's understanding of being a first. Yeah, so I think in general, it's not a very good sentiment, I would say.
We have another question from
Sorry,
Stars
if I may add, despite the fact that there are so many descendants of Chinese immigrants or Chinese immigrants living here, especially in the Bay Area, right? So, yeah.
The next question comes from Stars alumnus Mark Schwartz. He is the deputy CFO of TKB. He's asking, what is your opinion about the impact of Trump's latest Near East deal on the election?
I think that remains to be seen. He was trying to sell it tonight as one of his big foreign policy accomplishments. And I mean, also, as you might have heard, Mike Pompeo gave a speech which was unprecedented for a Secretary of State to get this involved in a convention. He gave his speech from Jerusalem, from a roof terrace of a prestigious hotel there, and he was also mentioning the deal. I think if the general public is really gonna buy it as like such an historic accomplishment, or if they're just gonna think of it as like that he just wanted to set a check mark behind another promise kept, basically, I think that remains to be seen. That's going to be, I'm curious about that for the next couple of weeks moving forward too.
We have another question from Willy Beer. He's the owner of China and Asia Focus. Willy's asking, have you ever experienced any censorship, whether direct or indirect, while reporting from the US? Any taboo topics you are not supposed to report about?
You mean, if I can follow up on that, you mean from American authorities or from my editors in Zurich?
I assume from any side, direct or indirect.
Yeah. Clear, like I mean, clearly not from my editors. Like it's one of the really wonderful things about NZZ that as a correspondent, you can just pitch your own stories and they really trust the insights that you have firsthand here in the country. And it's like there are no taboos at all. And also from authorities, I'm trying to think. I mean, sometimes things are held off the record, and I feel like Americans keep more background briefings like on background than I'm used to from Europe. But no, actually, I think especially compared to, so if you do an interview in, this might be a little insight into journalistic works in German-speaking Europe. In general, in Switzerland and in Germany, and I believe also in Austria, when you do an interview with someone, it's usually heavily edited afterwards, and then you send it to your interview partner again for authorization, right? So every quote that you take from someone is usually authorized again. And here in the US, that's not the case. That's unheard of. If someone doesn't say this is on background or whatever, you can quote them. I mean, you got to make sure the quote is right. So that's actually the opposite of censorship that I'm really enjoying here too. I feel like they're usually very open. No, so I can't think of an instance. I have to brainstorm a little bit more, but nothing comes to my mind.
I take a final question from the audience before we have to wrap up. The question comes from Bruno Gehrig. He's a board member of Merki Baumann. He's asking, does the presidential election make a difference relative to the necessity for Europe to increase its safety? So regardless of whether Trump or Biden is elected, does Europe have to do more for its own security?
So, I mean, Trump's criticism that NATO needs to get its game up, and especially Germany, right? I mean, that's a criticism that other presidents have uttered too, like Barack Obama had demanded the same thing, so did George W. Bush. Trump just found a different tone to it, but it's been it's been an opinion here in the US for quite some time that Germany especially, but also other NATO members just need to live up to their obligations or their commitments, right? So yes, I think that independent of who's gonna win, that tone might persist, that opinion. However, I mean, when it comes to the stationing of troops in Germany as opposed to Poland, as opposed to withdrawing them for good from Europe, like just having less presence or like a smaller presence of US troops in Europe, I would say that that's something where it's going to make a difference if Biden or Trump sits in the White House, just because Trump tonight again mostly cares about what Americans think of him. And he keeps making that promise that American sons and daughters need to return home. And Joe Biden also has in mind what his European allies want from him and might be more open to pressure from Europeans to at least keep up the presence in Europe. That's my opinion.
If you allow, I have two final questions for you.
Okay.
Okay. Moving back to the topic of journalism. Generally speaking, what do you see as the biggest challenge today for journalism?
I would say it's a little different from being in the US or being in Europe, I would say, but to answer this question generically, I would say trying to stay an independent, critical voice, I would say, and not trying to have your opinion swayed by what you read in other outlets or what the main sentiment is, or what, you know, like for instance, just to give you an example, like overall, the attitude towards Donald Trump in Europe is very critical. And if you just like accept that or just make that attitude your own, it's gonna stop you from doing good reporting, right? And it's also gonna stop you from fully understanding Trump's appeal. And you just, I mean, that's just one easy example, but also other things about what should be America's role in the world, right? Just like not make any assumptions just because it's mainstream opinion. And I think keeping a critical mindset in a world where everyone just shares their opinions on social media and like the media is present everywhere and you get push notifications on your phone, right? I think just figuring out what you think is right, I think that's a challenge.
Final question then. What makes you happy as a journalist?
What makes me happy, like truly happy, is, and I think I said something like that at the beginning, is when I get to like interactions with people, and if they ideally happen in a setting that's not, that I wouldn't get to experience if it weren't for my job. So like if I go on the campaign trail and not because I physically get access somewhere, but because people take the time to talk with me. And I'm not, what makes me happiest aren't conversations with politicians or CEOs, because usually they're just so trained in talking with media. It's really like everyday people that you might not have met, you probably would never have met otherwise. And if they're willing to talk with you, like I remember, as a final anecdote, in 2016, I was still an editor in Zurich, but NZZ also wants our editors to get out, and I got to go to Florida to cover the presidential election there. And I went to this senior living area that's called The Villages. It's pretty famous. It's this huge settlement of retirees living in Florida. And there I spoke with the head of the Republican party of the villages, basically. And he was like this dude with a big head and like cowboy boots and of course a convertible. And he then just offered to like drive me around and show me like his inside of that part of Florida, like his what's most remarkable in his opinion. And just talking with him about politics and how it feels about Trump, that's sort of what sticks with you for months to come too, because that's the type of Trump supporter that you think of when he says something again. So all of this to say, interactions with everyday Americans make me very happy, and they're currently not very much possible. So we'll see what's going to be possible at all in the next couple of weeks. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we have to leave it at that. Thank you very much, Astrid, for your time and for sharing your insights with us. Thank you, Astrid.
Yeah, thank you all very much for coming.
I'd also like to thank all our alumni who participated in this webinar. In the next STARS webinar on 4th of September, in a week from now, we will talk with STARS alumnus Pradeep Basu. He is the co-founder and CEO of Censorship, a decision analytics startup based in Bangalore. They use the power of satellite data mining and AI, and he will tell us how agri-tech can help to feed the planet and fight climate change. I hope to see you there. In the meantime, take care and stay healthy. Thank you. Goodbye.